keep your microphone and video muted or off. And stop presenting also, because the presenter has a PPT to present. Knowingly or unknowingly, don't present yourself, your screen. Only the presenter I can make a presentation. So we are starting our webinar. On behalf of the Viscom Department of Loyola College and the Loyola College Management, all the staff members, I welcome all the participants for the webinar series number 9. Today's topic for our discussion: media representations in a crisis, domestic violence during the COVID-19 pandemic lockdown. As all of us know that we have a number of domestic violence reported and unreported. And in fact, if you come across daily newspapers, news channels, in television, you come across a lot of stories of reported domestic violence against women and children. Both are vulnerable target group. So what are the ways women were affected in the domestic situation, domestic violence? That is the main topic we are going to discuss, and how media represented and how media brought out this domestic violence to the public. And there are only few reported news about domestic violence. There are hundreds of incidents unreported in the media. So we are going to reflect and discuss on this topic. For today's topic, we have a presenter from Northeastern Hill University, Mrs. Karen Donoghue. She's a young professor. She has a MA in Journalism Mass Communication and presently doing her PhD at the same university. She's also assistant professor in the Department of Journalism Mass Communication. Her area of research, representation of Northeast India in news magazines. And before that, she has also taught in mass media department of St. Anthony's College, Shillong. She has also worked as a video editor and assistant director on various projects associated with different media houses in Shillong, Northeast. Her research interests include representation, media and gender, and television studies. And I hear from her fellow faculty members, she is a well-read person, very much interested in research, presenting papers, and so on. So when I approached her to speak on this topic, pandemic situation and domestic violence, she readily accepted. She has done a lot of homework. She has beautifully prepared a PPT. And we have such a young professor who has a sincere research venture. So I'm happy to invite, on behalf of all the participants present and Loyola College Viscom Department, for this very timely and relevant topic. I hand over the session, webinar session, to Miss Karen Donoghue. Yeah. Over to Karen.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Raj. Let me preface my webinar by saying that it is such a pleasure to be here amongst all of you. I can't see most of you presently, but I hope to interact with you all in the interaction.
During discussion, we can see, yeah.
Discussion, yes. And thank you so much for having me on this platform. So today, as Dr. Raj has already said, we will be discussing domestic violence during the pandemic lockdown. And specifically, my area of interest is in media and gender, and also in representations. And we'll look at that also a little bit. So we will start without much further ado. Today in this webinar, we will broadly look at firstly the idea of media and gender. Everybody, I'm sure you are aware of media separately, gender separately, but how do the two concepts intersect? That is something that we'll be looking at. The other thing I want to talk about is a few basic concepts and criticality of representation. Why representation is important? Why is it that scholars like myself continue to research representation and to look into that aspect of media? And then we'll also look at domestic violence as a phenomenon. That will be sort of an introduction into domestic violence, although I'm certain everybody is aware of domestic violence. And we'll go into domestic violence in times of crisis, and then we'll speak about global scenarios, what's happening around the world in terms of COVID-19 and domestic violence, and also including children. What has been the effect, or how has this pandemic affected children as well, who also are often violated in that sense. We'll also look at the Indian scenario, and we will look at different media representations. Now, I have tried to cover as broad a terrain as I could when it comes to media representation, both spatially and also in terms of subject and things like that. But you have to understand that in a webinar, I could not cover everything, but there should be enough there to give us a lot of meat or a lot of material for discussion. And we'll end with a few suggestions, and maybe we can incorporate the suggestions into the interactive session, because I know that a lot of my own colleagues and friends are also here, so it would be nice to hear your thoughts as well. This will not be one way. Okay, so we'll get into it. So firstly, how is gender studies related to media? This is a question I get asked quite often. The first thing we have to remember is that media is a reflection of socio-political power. And it is supposed to be a reflection of, media discourses always have embedded in them relations of power. So in terms of, if any of you are from critical studies or cultural studies, you understand that the production of knowledge, the distribution of knowledge, all of this has to do with power. And media essentially does that. It produces and distributes knowledge. And so media is not simply sitting in cinema and watching a Shah Rukh Khan film. It's a lot more than that. So there's a lot of socio-political realities embedded in media. And secondly, the media represents a socially acceptable way of life in a certain sense. What is current, what is acceptable, what is not, what is the norm, what is not. But the third and most important thing that I want to concentrate on, and I want to tell everybody, is that we should think of media not just as a vehicle to sort of plant dominant ideologies or hegemonical ideologies into people, but rather think of it as a cultural platform.
Karen, once again. Karen?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Your PPT is not visible to everyone. Please present it again.
Oh, shall I? Okay, so I'll stop sharing and I'll redo it, huh? Okay.
Yeah.
Just do it again from the beginning. Apologies.
No problem.
Okay. Let me present again. Is it coming now?
Yeah. Wait.
Please.
Go to, yeah, now it's coming.
It's coming? Okay.
Yeah.
Shall I continue?
Yeah, pin it. Pin the presentation.
Yeah. So media as a cultural platform, very important to think of media as a platform that, that apart from just reinforcing dominant ideologies, is also a place where we can challenge a lot of things. And that makes media very, very crucial to the conversation of gender. We know that gender is produced and reproduced through media. You guys might think, how can that be? How is it? But when you talk about media practices, and when you talk about things that I've listed down there, for instance, socialization and how much we learn from the media. So first, let's start with the first point, which is reflecting and maintaining of existing gender differences and inequality. It's very interesting. There is a 1940s serial called Father Knows Best, which clips of it are available in YouTube. And over there, it was in the 1940s, of course, in America. But the girl wanted to become an engineer, right? But the father wouldn't allow her because saying that you're a girl, so you can't be an engineer. So when I show my students that clip, some of them cringe very visibly and they say, how could that have been the sort of thought system? But we have to understand that media is a reflection of society. And the 1940s television serial was a reflection of that point of time. So a lot of times we do see gender inequalities and, gender differences on sometimes even constructed, sometimes even exaggerated on media. It constructs those differences, as we have spoken about, especially in terms of, if you look today at gendered bodies, what we think of as a feminine body, what we think of as feminine beauty, what we think of as masculine body, what we think of as masculine beauty. I hate to burst everybody's bubbles, but not everybody looks like, Madhuri Dixit or, I don't know, Ranbir Kapoor, right? There's a very realistic idea, sense of beauty which is there, which media tries to undermine. And in doing so, it reproduces also gender inequalities. There's, through certain rhetoric. If you watch, I'll not say specific names, but if you watch certain Indian serials, or if you watch certain movies, or if you have read any of the fairy tales, we do know that, because even fairy tales are media. Let's not think of media just in terms of electronic media, print media, but a broader perspective of media as being a portal of cultural. So you have a lot of inequalities that are in media. The last thing is socialization, because why is it important? Because our kids, these days, when I was small, I used to play with marbles and, go out and play house with my friends and, all of that stuff. But now, if you see kids, most of them are on their mobile phones. And they're watching serials or they're watching cartoons. And so our media, teaches children in a lot of ways how to be a woman, how to be a man. Those type of ideas are embedded into media, which is why media and gender are very closely in. The next thing I want to talk about very quickly, but it's very, very important, is the idea of representation. Now, when I say representation, it can mean a couple of things. Specifically, it can mean two different things. So the first is representation as something depicting something else or a portrayal. Like, for instance, a photograph is a representation or portrayal of somebody else. A representation can also mean standing in for something else in place of, for instance, we have political representatives who stand in place of us in political platforms. And so we talk about gender representations, both of these concepts or both of these notions together. Representation as a depiction and representation also as a very important take away from a very banal, notative concept of representation was given by Stuart Hall. So Stuart Hall says that representation is constitutive to an event. Right? So what do I mean by that? So he said that representation is not something that happens after an event. It is a part of the event. Right? What he means is that nothing meaningful takes place outside the event. He's saying that nothing meaningful takes place outside of representation. Okay, so what that means is basically you think of discourse as conceptual frameworks within which we generate meaning. So, for instance, right now, if a forest fell in the tree and none of us heard it or saw it fall, it still fell. But what Stuart Hall is saying is that even though physical acts like that, physical things like that do happen, they're not really meaningful unless you bring them into the realm of discourse. Okay, so which is why representation today, any platform, any groups of people, NGOs, right? Any community, everybody is fighting for fair and better representation on different platforms because representation is very crucial. It is not an afterthought or a secondary thing. It is constitutive to the event. Okay, so I stay in the Northeast. I live in the Northeast. A lot of times, a lot of things that happen here would not be disseminated to the rest of the country. And so for the rest of the country, the things that happen here are meaningless because you don't even hear about it. Okay, so that is what Stuart Hall's concept of representation is. We'll come back to that later on in the seminar as we go on. Very quickly, symbolic annihilation. One of my colleagues has already touched upon this topic in an earlier episode. I just want to touch upon it very briefly. So George Gerbner, in his 1976 study, which is very interesting, and I recommend that everybody who is interested in a very social science bent of research, empirical research should go for that. It's called television violence profiling on television. And he did this immense study. And one of the things he said was that representation in the fictional world signifies social existence and vice versa. Now, what he means is that people who are visible in the symbolic world of media are generally in a better position in reality, in physical, in real life, or in sort of how in the community aspect in that realm. What he means by that, we'll come to that. Gate Tuckman, she further divided this concept into three: omission, trivialization, and condemnation. Right. So, what George Gerbner and Gate Tuckman are trying to say is that if you are alive and existing and thriving in the symbolic world of media, you're probably alive and thriving and existing in reality as well. Okay, I want to be very careful and not sort of draw a hard line between symbolic existence and real existence. That's not what I'm trying to say. What I'm trying to say is that the two of them go hand in hand. Symbolic significance signifies social significance, social existence. Right? And so when you think of who you see on television or who you see in newspapers or who you watch in news shows, think also about who is being omitted, right? Whose issues are being trivialized or made small and made petty, and who are being condemned in the media. That's very, very important, because chances are those who are condemned by the media will also be condemned in social circles. We'll come back more. There is a reason I'm coming with all of this. We'll come back more to that. We will get back to this in later slides. Okay, so see, Solis in a study in 2018 says that symbolic annihilation is often a precursor of actual annihilation. Let me give you all an example. I come from the Northeast, where we have certain very draconian laws. And a lot of deaths here are undocumented. I'll not go very deep into that because that is not a part of what I'm speaking about today. But the point is that because these deaths are not reported, right, and because you do not see so much of people from here on national media, there, the symbolic annihilation actually somehow translates into a sort of actual annihilation. Very recently, an American man named George Floyd, an African-American man, was brutally, I should say, he was manhandled and he was murdered, pretty much. And if you contextualize it to that, even there is, even in the United States, there is a certain sense of symbolic annihilation of certain races, certain classes, certain communities, and that actually translates into actual annihilation. Now we can, extrapolate that to talk about India as well. So that is what is meant by symbolic annihilation, and that is why it is still relevant. The only problem is that it's a very, the only criticism of this would be that it's very, it's based more on a hypodermic needle kind of thing where you predict certain effects. So, but apart from that, it is a good place to start analyzing text with. So now we'll go into domestic violence. The term was first used in an address to the Parliament of the United Kingdom by Jack Ashley in 1973. And domestic violence is basically indoor crime, which happens in an intimate relationship such as dating, marriage, cohabitation, or familial relationship. It is also called intimate partner violence, or IPV. I will be often using abbreviations, please be forewarned. So DV stands for domestic violence, IPV stands for intimate partner violence, and GBV stands for gender-based violence. They're not entirely different things. They're not entirely the same thing, but they're all different sides of the same coin. Now, Bradbury Jones says that domestic violence refers to a range of violations that happen within a domestic space. It is a broad term that encompasses intimate partner violence as well, as we have talked about. So, moving on. 1 in 3 women worldwide, and this is a very, very important statistic. Please, I'll be going through quite a few statistics, but keep this one in mind. Try to remember this one. 1 in 3 women worldwide have experienced physical, sexual violence by an intimate partner, or sexual violence by any perpetrator in their lifetime, which means that I don't know how many women are there joining us today or how many men, but chances are all of you know somebody who has suffered from, not domestic violence, but sexual violence of some sort, not necessarily domestic. Now, the health impacts of violence, particularly intimate partner and domestic violence on women and their children, are very, very significant. This is what, if any of you are interested, there's a lot of material on this, and the World Health Organization has also prepared many reports on this. If anyone is interested, you can definitely go and see these things. Now, in India, we have a particular act that I want to talk about, because this is one that specifically addresses domestic violence. Okay, so apart from this, we have other acts, for example, the Atrocities Against SC/STs Act and all that, but something specifically designed to address the issue of domestic violence is this act. It's called the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, 2005. It was enacted in October 2006, I think, and also it was amended later on, sometime in 2013 or 16, one of those years. Anyway, the point is that this is the first dedicated act that we have, and these are the things that it constitutes. I'll just read them out. Firstly, any act, omission, or commission or conduct shall constitute domestic violence. Any act, omission, or commission, meaning that even if you tell somebody to do this, you are still, you are still liable, or you're still, you can still be sort of found guilty by this act. Any act, omission, or commission shall constitute domestic violence in case it, number one, harms or injures or endangers the health, safety, life, limb, or well-being, whether mental or physical, very important, of the aggrieved person, including causing physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal, emotional abuse, economic abuse. Please keep that in mind, all the different kinds of abuses. The second thing is if it harasses, harms, injures, or may, force the person to meet any unlawful demand for dowry or other property. That's another very important, especially in the Indian context. I think everybody will may have witnessed at some point in their life some sort of violence because of property. This act also covers that. Thirdly, if any act threatens the aggrieved person relating to any of the conducts by A or B, and lastly, otherwise injures, causes harm, whether physical or mental, to the aggrieved person. You cannot even threaten somebody with these things, because even that is, you can be penalized for that. And lastly, you cannot also cause any sort of, not just physical harm, mental harm. Now, the significance of this act, apart from just, apart from being the only act that specifically looks at domestic violence, is that it opens up, the understanding of domestic violence to include not just physical abuse. When you think of domestic violence, you're thinking of somebody, somebody bashing somebody else, physically beating somebody, but it also includes sexual abuse. It also includes verbal and emotional and even economic abuse. So these are the reasons why this act is very important. And I don't know how far it's being implemented in different states, but this is a very relevant act, and I thought it deserved mention. Now, we have to know that since the 1990s, many countries have begun to act to combat violence against women, especially after 1993, when the UN endorsed the idea that violence against women violates human rights, right? So it's only in 1993 that people suddenly woke up and said, violence against women violates human rights. It took as long as 1993 to get there, but it's not all bad news. Since then, most countries have enacted a lot of laws, a lot of penalties, a lot of criminal procedures, a lot of different things in place so that this, in order to domestic violence from happening, or deter it at least. However, few countries are still exceptions. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but I'm just going to run through some of them here. The green ones are the ones that have proper legislation. The yellow ones are the countries that have penalties. And the last is neither. So you can still see that there are many countries, like in the some countries in the North African region, and China, Russia, and a few other countries, they still have less of these kind of penalties and laws. So, in other words, domestic, and the thing with those countries is a few of the Middle Eastern countries, Northern African countries, and such places still do not have very strong laws. And you have to also see that there is a correlation between women's movements in these places and the lack of rights. So these places are not places that have seen strong feminist or women's movements. So it does make a difference to speak out, is the point that I'm driving at. So basically, domestic violence still persists. Mainly, and the reasons I've just tried to give in a very small little nutshell, in the state level, because there's a lot of lofty campaigning, right? And a lot of high level promises. We'll talk about that a lot more later on. But there are no properly funded or detailed interventions. That is the problem. And at a personal level, one of the things that I often encounter is people saying, why does she stay in that situation? Why can't she get out? But in fact, the truth is that, when you have physical violence, when you have mental manipulation, harm, and very, very often when you have economic dependence on somebody else, it's not that easy to break away. So I think that today, if anybody thinks that people are in situations of domestic violence because they choose to be there and because somehow they accept it, I think that would be misinformation, and I think that would be incorrect of us to conclude that way, because we do not understand the sort of mental anguish that these people go through, people who have suffered through domestic violence. So now we'll look specifically at domestic violence in a crisis, not necessarily the pandemic, but any other sort of crisis. Violence against women tends to increase during any sort of emergency, including epidemics like the one that we are in right now, including pandemics like the one we are in right now. Women, especially with disabilities and who have specific conditions, like who are already less underprivileged. For instance, women who are displaced, who are refugees, who are in places of conflict, they always tend to be even worse affected by these sort of by domestic violence in these times. And women tend to face greater risks during emergencies, and not just health emergencies. I've given an example of this Mira Komarovsky's, the Unemployed Man and His Family. Mira Komarovsky is one of the heroines of sociology. She's one of the first women to really look at gender, women's rights and gender studies in a very, I should say, scientific way. She wrote this book called The Unemployed Man and His Family, based on her dissertation, which she, by the way, did under Paul Lazarsfeld. If anybody here is from the media background, I think we've all heard of Paul Lazarsfeld, who, although he was a mathematician, he gave us the two-step flow theory and things like that. So anyway, her study was on American families, and she did a very in-depth analysis of how economic hardships. So she wrote this between 1935 and 1940. So that was the time that I think, if we, America was going through some sort of economic slump, and she sort of focused on that and talked about how, went into how this economic hardship, so economic turmoil, affects families, and also looked at the effect, especially on women. So this was one of her findings, and it's very interesting, her body of works. And then anyway, crisis and times of unrest have always been linked to increased interpersonal violence, including incidents of violence against women and children. Women and children, VAWC, another violence against women and children. All right, this is given by different studies that I had reviewed and I had read. Look at this, some instances. In Othello, Washington, after the eruption of Mount St. Helens. So this is a volcanic eruption, totally different from the pandemic. But domestic violence reports increased by 40%. After Hurricane Katrina, which I think everybody remembers quite well, reports of psychological abuse went up by 35%. Reports of physical partner abuse went up by, almost doubled, is what this other study says. Now, Yasmin 2016 said that an epidemic of rape, sexual assault, and violence against women and girls was going on during the Ebola. And she said that one of the things that was very striking and heartbreaking is that most of this there was absolute silence on all of this. So maybe in the interaction, I can ask if anyone read of any of these things during the Ebola. Right. Personally, I hadn't read I hadn't seen many reports of sexual violence. Most of the focus was on Ebola. Okay, so and then the Black Saturday bushfires in Australia and the earthquake, the horrendous earthquake that took place in Haiti. So these are the things that take place. Okay, anyway, and then IFRC, which is the International Federation for Red Cross and Red Crescent societies. Red Cross, Red Crescent, I'm sure everybody's aware, they're humanitarian societies, humanitarian organizations. They prepared a global report. This was the last one that they'd done, 2015. And one of the things that they say is that it's very, very difficult to research GBV, gender-based violence, especially after disasters, because GBV is usually hidden, especially during disasters. It's hidden, and it takes on many, many forms, including domestic violence, sexual exploitation, child marriage, children's trafficking. So it takes on so many different forms. And the other thing that this study says is that those responding to disasters are not even aware, may not even be aware that gender-based violence may increase in disasters. So I have personally been to at least one disaster preparedness seminar, many years ago. It was held by a German gentleman. He took us through a lot of different aspects, but one of the things that I can very clearly recall was not spoken about was domestic violence. So it tends to go under the radar, right? So reporting and law enforcement mechanisms as well as services are often disrupted by disasters. This makes it even more difficult, because all of the mechanisms that we have in place, like the hotlines, if you're going through abuse, call this number, or children can call this number, this, that. Or you have all of these NGOs doing wonderful work, all of their linkages, all of their roadmaps that they've created over the years, everything becomes disrupted during a crisis. And this also hampers the collection of data on gender-based violence prevalence during disasters. So meaning that it's very, very difficult to document accurately the kind of gender-based violence that takes place during disasters. Now, and lack of data sadly results in a lack of awareness, as I pointed out. Some of the factors that lead to more domestic abuse during the COVID-19, I don't know if you've thought of any of these, but let's think about them. Firstly, there's a lack of focus on the repercussions of social distancing on interpersonal relationships, meaning that two people, if you are, they say, right, in English, absence makes the heart fonder, right? So in a sort of opposite manner, if people are together constantly, then there's bound to be some tension. There's bound to be some interpersonal tension in interpersonal relationships. There's a wide variety of restrictions on movement, financial constraints, and these also encourage abusers, especially when somebody is stressed. If somebody has the tendency or the proclivity to be abusive and violent, they probably will be even more so at these times. Then, and continuation of that, aggressors increase stress due to fear of falling ill, uncertainty about the future, and things like that. And the next thing is this impossibility of social contact. So, during this lockdown period, everybody has been like social distancing, right? Social distancing, maintaining distance. But what if, there are people, and there actually are people who are having domestic violence issues. They have no outlet. They cannot leave. They cannot go and meet other people. They cannot meet their family or their friends to talk about this. They cannot seek help in NGOs. And so this has made things extremely impossible in a certain sense. And then access to vital sexual reproductive health services, including for women subjected to violence, has become more limited. Right? So today, if I hear of a case, something is going on in my neighbor's house, I wouldn't know. It would be very difficult to know whom to approach. And even if we did know who to approach, what kind of actions would they take in a situation where we have to maintain social distancing? So these are the kind of questions. And the next thing is excessive consumption of alcoholic beverages and other psychoactive substances. The beverage consumption, especially in the US, if anybody is on Instagram or Twitter or, those popular, or even Facebook, you will see that people are posting images of drinking during the day, indulging in behaviors that they normally would not do. But because of lockdown and they're bored and because of different excuses, they're doing these things, and these can also lead to domestic violence. Uh, Women are generally overloaded with housework. They have to, look after the elderly. They have to look after the children. And in such a situation, this can reduce her ability to avoid conflict with the aggressor. At other times, maybe you can avoid conflict, but when you're there in that space and you're constrained to those four walls, you have to deal with the aggressor much more, and that leads to more incidences. And there's also fear of violence because of the children that are involved, and this is another paralyzing factor. So I've read a lot of stories of women where they have just taken a beating from their husbands, or they have tried to distract their husbands so that the children would not suffer. That's another angle that must be thought about. And finally, financial dependence due to economic stagnation and the impossibility of informal work. So because in our country, such a high percentage of women are in informal work, informal sectors, and they've been the marginalized. For instance, the migrants, the people who are in the informal sectors in our country have been the worst hit by the pandemic thus far. I just wanted to bring that into focus as well. So now we'll look at a global perspective of the global pandemic. Maybe it's not very clear in your screens, but I'll just read it out for you. Globally, 243 million women and girls aged 15 to 49 in that age group, they have been subjected to sexual physical violence perpetrated by an intimate partner in the previous 12 months. 12 months, 243 million cases. So imagine, and this is what they say, the number is likely to increase as security, health, and money worries, heightened tensions, and are accentuated by cramped and confined living conditions like the pandemic presently. So these are the emergent data. Now, data, like I've said, is always very difficult to say that this is absolutely correct. This is absolutely correct with domestic violence, because, like I said, there's always, especially in a disaster, there's always the difficulty of finding out accurate numbers. But these are as much as accurate as I suppose we have presently. In France, reports of domestic violence have increased by 30% since the lockdown that they have imposed in March 17th. In Argentina, emergency calls have increased by 25%. In Cyprus and Singapore, helplines have registered increases in their calls for help by 30 and 33%. And Canada, Germany, Spain, UK, and the US all also have reported increases in such things. And remember that these are developed countries, possibly with better facilities than, let's say, where majority have better facilities than majority in our country. And so these are very, very worrying statistics. So reports of increasing domestic rates are beginning to surface around the world, as we have said. And there are reports that are emerging from Australia, Brazil, China, USA. Reports are increasing by the day in different parts of the world. So, for instance, in China, domestic violence is reported to have tripled during their shelter-in-place mandate. I just want to say one thing. When China was the only one having lockdown before COVID-19 had spread everywhere, one of the very popular jokes that had come out of it was rather insensitive, but it was a joke. It was meant to be a joke as humor, was that, many people in China are getting divorced because of COVID-19. Please keep that joke in mind, because I will come back to it. There is a significance to that. Anyway, and the number of domestic cases reported in Jingzhou, a city in Hubei province, has tripled in February 2020, tripled compared to last year. So we can immediately just see before our very eyes that this pandemic, the lockdown in COVID-19 is having quite an effect on the incidence of domestic violence globally. France has increased 30% report. Spain, other countries, many countries are starting to, these sort of horrific domestic violence, homicides, murders, these kind of things, reports are starting to surface slowly. And they're quite horrible and quite horrific, rather. And Brazil estimates also that domestic violence reports have jumped 40 to 50%. Italy has also reported the same. And so, although in popular culture, like you see Spain, I think everybody must have seen, Italians on their balconies singing together and people exercising on their roofs. But this is just a pretty picture that I would say popular media is painting for us. There is a lot of tears, and I dare say bloodshed behind those doors and those happy smiles. And so that is something that we are trying to open our eyes to and open our perception to today in this class. US also has reported, imagine, in USA, violence perpetrators are using COVID-19 as a weapon against their victims. This is not just in the USA, it's in many, many places where people have used the general sort of fear kind of that lingers in the air, or the tension that lingers in the air of, fear of the disease to kind of control. Abusers have used this to control their victims even more tightly. And some people have even forbidden hand washing. In fact, the opposite has happened. There were cases in the US, also I was reading about it, where the abusers have forced their partners to wash their hands till their hands, the skin starts peeling off. And so it has, in many different ways, COVID-19, the lockdown has impacted the incidence of domestic violence. Agencies from across the United States are also reporting an increase in domestic violence. In Australia, a survey of 400 frontline workers are people who are working right at the, sort of like doctors, nurses, and also people who are first responders. Okay, so the frontline workers have indicated that 40% reported an increase in pleas for help or in cries for help, and 70% have indicated an increase in the complexity of cases. So there are two things to take away from here. First, increase in cases have been reported. Secondly, the complexity of the cases themselves have been reported, because earlier, without lockdown, you could take the victims away from the house, take them to a safe house, get them counseling, get the abusers, the perpetrators also must be counseled. Remember that. I haven't included that in my slides, but when I speak of counseling and help for the victims, I also think that a sort of counterbalance must be there, where you do help. You criminally penalize them, definitely, but you also should try, and there should be effort to help and counsel abusers as well. But none of this is possible in a lockdown situation. It's very, very difficult, especially with social distancing. Who would go and respond? Who would go and rescue the children or the women or the men or whatever the case may be? Right. So these are the things that are happening now. A little bit about children in pandemic. Now here it's very interesting because we have a bit of a conflicting report. Now, decreasing reports of child abuse or neglect have been experienced during the pandemic. In the US, the reason for this is 67% of these reports come from victims from professionals, and 19% of the reports come from education personnel. Now, the problem is that how will this take place in a situation where you have lockdown, where the main people who are reporting children's abuse of children or domestic abuse against children or violence against children are unable to, do not have the support system and mechanisms, or cannot come out because of the lockdown, because of the pandemic. So you can imagine that although they are decreasing reports, that is actually a cause of worry. So that is a very important paradox that's happening there. And there is a growing concern that there will be an overwhelming number of child abuse and neglects when children do come back to schools, right? Because it's in schools that children talk to their teachers or talk to their mentors or talk to their friends. And it is, like we said, look at this statistic, 67%, 19% of the reports come from, education institutions. So the fear is that there will be a huge number of cases that were bedded during the pandemic or during COVID-19. And there also the issue of children and pets who reside in 60% where domestic violence is perpetrated who are also at risk. Right? 60% of these households where domestic violence takes place also have children and pets who are also automatically, just by being in that environment, at risk. Now we look at the Indian scenario. We all know India has a patriarchal setup where it has become an acceptable norm to abuse women. This was written by Dr. Vidyottama. She is an advocate. Now, more interestingly, we are the fifth lowest in the Global Gender Gap Report. This is quite very, very disappointing. Is too light a word. We have to pull up our socks when it comes to closing the gender gap. Okay, we are the fifth lowest, meaning we're the 149th among 153 people. Guys, let that sink in. That is, I think, if nothing else, that is quite a badge of shame for our country, for all of us collectively, and we have to work in that area. And we are followed only by Pakistan, Yemen, Syria, and Iraq. And these countries, have not historically had very good gender equality equations or any of that sort of thing. So the fact that India is above only them is a very, very big cause of concern, at least to me. And according to the International Labour Organization, like we've said, 81% of Indian women work in the informal economy. Not only do we have very few women working women in India, quote unquote, proper working women in India, 81% of them work in the informal sector, which makes it even more problematic. One of the reasons that women do not even leave or that women do not even enter the workforce or they leave it so soon is because of this idea that women have to be the primary caregivers. But hopefully that will change, and that is changing slowly. I've seen, many parents now, many families now having shared responsibilities. But the truth is that this is still what the case is, and because 81% of Indian women work in the informal economy, that makes them even more vulnerable in times of pandemic to domestic violence. So, in that light, when we talk about stay home and stay safe, it feels a little bit ironic, right? Because home and safety are not synonymous for some of these people. And the National Commission for Women has actually reported a sharp rise in the number of distress calls during the COVID-19 lockdown. And Rekha Sharma there says that men confined to home are taking out their frustration on women. These frustrations must be economic. It must be because of social anxieties that are there. You cannot go out, you cannot meet your friends, and you have something pending up. And Rekha Sharma says that a lot of times men do take these out on women. And this is a point that I would like, which I kept a question there. I'd really like some of you to please discuss this during the Q&A session, interactive session that we have. Domestic abuse is worse in poor sections of society. It is debatable, I feel, because while economic constraints may be one of the reasons that domestic abuse occurs, I think it's not the only reason. I think that it is just more visible in poor sections of the society because when you have rich, powerful people, it's easier for them, as we all know so well from the many examples that we've had even in the recent past. When people are in a very strong, high, powerful positions, especially when they're men, it's much easier to disguise domestic abuse. And so this idea that it is poor men doing the domestic violating does not sit well with me personally, but you are very free to argue with me in the interactive session. Please keep this in mind. Now, the NCRP, or the National Crime Research Bureau, has released this report saying that a crime is recorded against women in India every 1.7 minutes. Women is subject to domestic violence every 4.4 minutes. Now, when you think about these two sort of statistics together, you understand that, every 1.7 minutes, a crime is being committed against a woman. Now, considering that a majority considering this, one would conclude that a majority of the women that we know would have faced something even in the past 5 minutes, theoretically, right? And so this is something that this basically just talks about how recurrent domestic violence is. Now, the National Family Health Survey 2015-16 says that 30% of women in India have experienced physical violence. I think if there are women in this panel, they would also be able to vouch for that, some of them. And the most interesting thing and sad thing is that among married women, the domestic violence perpetrators were reported to be the husband, 83% of the times, the husband's mothers, 56% of the times, fathers, 33% of the times, and siblings. So you see this IPV factor coming in now, intimate partner violence, right? When we say intimate partner, it's not just your sexual or your romantic partner, but familial relations. So very intimate relationships, these domestic violence cases are happening, and that is very disturbing. And the most disturbing thing is that less than 1% of them seek help. So the NCW, National Commission for Women, noted a rise in number of domestic violence complaints via email. Now, why I say via email is because only 29% of Indian women are supposed to have access to the internet. So you can imagine the very small percentage of women who have been able to report the cases, the incidents. These are few snapshots I just want to share with you all. 23rd of March to 10th of April, lockdown happening. A total of 370 complaints were lodged. Majority were of domestic violence. They were all received through email. And the second, this is interesting, the second highest number of complaints were the right to live with dignity category. Right? So the right to live with dignity basically means where you don't have direct sort of physical violence happening, but there is some sort of emotional or financial abuse or mental abuse that is happening. So that also is an offensive, is a crime. Is what would you call it? Is you are liable. You are liable to answer for that if if you do something like that, cause somebody else emotional or mental distress or indulge in that kind of abuse. So that is what we mean by right to live with dignity. So that is also considered, which is such great news that our country is, at least in terms of legislation and on paper, we are moving ahead in that correct direction. The number of cases, although we must keep in mind, not necessarily proportional to the actual rise in domestic violence. I have explained to you all why it is so difficult to get accurate numbers of domestic violence, and we'll talk about that again later on. Now, one thing is, Rajasthan, this is interesting, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Telangana, number of complaints received has actually decreased. Now, could this mean that domestic violence has decreased in these states? Or could it mean that maybe it's the same, but these women are not getting an opportunity to actually report it? Could it also be that domestic violence has actually increased and they have no means of reporting it? So this raises a lot of questions, right? The thing is that we should not be slaves to data. Is something that I always say. We should make data work for us for as long as we can. We must make data work for us. So when we see something is decreasing, we mustn't simply presume that domestic violence is decreasing. We must ask questions of the data, why the data is the way that it is. Now, in the second week of April, nearly 2,500 women in Delhi called the helpline numbers, right? And 50% of spurt in number of cases was also observed in Punjab since the lockdown. And so you have two different sort of situations happening there. One is where there's a spurt, lots of complaints. One is where there's less complaints. But like I said, we should not just look at data and presume that this is true. We should look at it and understand that places like Delhi and Punjab, maybe the women there have better access to means by which they can register their complaints. Maybe women in other states don't have those kind of means. So all of that, those are all questions that we should have in mind when we're looking at these sort of statistics. Now, there's also the queer angle, and there is also the rural-urban divide. So, for instance, Rituparna Bora, co-founder of Delhi-based Queer Nazariya, resource group for lesbian, bisexual women and trans men, said that the number of distress calls they've received has actually increased. And so there is also this... and then, of course, there's a helplessness there because you cannot even send volunteers out. All they could do, even when these distress calls come, is talk and try and give assurance and try and give counseling over the phone. But that person one-to-one, sort of interaction is not possible. Neither is it possible to remove that person from the situation of domestic abuse. So when we talk about domestic abuse, apart from just looking at women or children, and also we also have to consider queer folk. And there's also the urban-rural divide. See, for women in rural areas, who have to walk miles to get firewood, sexual violence from non-partners is twice as likely. And so that idea of how safe a woman is also very relative to whether the woman is in a urban space or in a rural space. Those sort of differences are there. Like I've said, this is the question that I had posed to you all. There are spikes in cases of some states and declines in others. What could this imply? This is the second question that I'm throwing at everybody today. Maybe this is something that some of you can try and answer for me in the interactive session and share with the rest of us. That'll be nice. I just want to read one or two incidents very quickly. Last week, Kerala State Women's Commission member Rashid Kamal got a call from Chennai pleading for help. The caller told her that his sister, resident of Idukki district of Kerala, and her daughter were hiding in a forest after the woman's husband ejected them from their home. The caller said that the animals had several wild attacks. Kamal immediately alerted the police and the matter was investigated. The husband was taken into custody. This is what he says, this is important. In some cases, a little counseling and advice will do, but cases like this need serious intervention. It is, in fact, in fact, during lockdown, domestic violence cases have increased. But if you ask me, data will be lesser. See, this is very important. Data will be lesser during the domestic violence. This is what the representative has said. Second incident, in Malda district of West Bengal last week, 26-year-old Sona Mandal was allegedly strangled by her husband of 5 years. Again, not a stranger. Both cases, husbands. Both cases, IPV, intimate partner violence. In another incident in the district, another woman was allegedly killed by her husband for protesting against the extramarital affair. Both men have been booked. There's hardly anything we can do at this moment. We have helped the victims to connect with local police stations, lawyers and local NGOs, said this person, Roy Chowdhury, who is an official of the Association of Protection of Democratic Rights. So you see a certain sense of helplessness is what I was trying to come at. A sense of doing something as much as we can, but we cannot do anything more than this. So this is because of the present lockdown situation. So there is always this case of, this is why I was talking about this in the beginning, that states need to have a very well thought out plan. But it cannot just end with people taking calls and counseling. Some action has to be taken, and that action is usually missing a lot in kinds of violence. Okay, next, alcohol and domestic violence. Most countries, this is important, most countries that have introduced booze bans, but alcohol bans, have done so to minimize the risk of people gathering spreading coronavirus. However, that being said, there's also a lot of countries that had taken certain steps to curb, to reduce alcohol consumption in order to reduce domestic violence. So, for instance, because the World Health Organization does say that alcohol can be a contributing factor, we can look at some more studies later on. In one study in South Africa, about 70% of the abuse victims identified alcohol and other drug abuse as the main risk factor. So, because alcohol is not it's not hallucinogenic. I don't think so. But the thing is that it changes, your perception. In colloquial parlance, we call it a spirit, right? We call it a spirit, not probably scientific reasons for that, but there's also a sort of metaphorical reason there, that when somebody takes alcohol or something else, they become something else. So that has contributed in 70% of the cases in South Africa. Just excuse me for a second. I'm just going to have a drink of water. My throat is getting a little dry.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, done. I'm back. So, alcohol is a factor. In Colombia, Bogota is a city in Colombia. The mayor restricted the alcohol sales to 1 bottle per shopper. This was done not for social distancing or anything. This was done to minimize domestic violence. Greenland also similarly banned alcohol sales in the capital Nuuk to reduce violence against children, and VAWC, right, violence against women and children. South Africa has banned alcohol since March 27th. Although I just read that South Africa is slowly starting to ease their restrictions, but they had banned alcohol for a very long time. In fact, South Africa not only banned alcohol, I think they also banned cigarettes and other tobacco products. People were very unhappy with the government, especially for banning cigarettes, but that is what happened. And Sri Lanka and Thailand have also imposed prohibitions, but they have slowly been lifting. So there are different reasons, but a lot of different countries have tried to curb domestic violence by curbing the amount of alcohol consumption. So coming to our country, I think everybody must have received a few funny pictures when, especially in states like where I am presently, Meghalaya, they had stopped the sale of alcohol for quite a long time. And so when they opened it, it was crazy. It was pandemonium. It was chaos. People were everywhere climbing over each other. Lines were like kilometers long trying to get alcohol. So I just found this from Business Insider, and I just found it a little funny. I thought I would share with you all how to implement social distancing at liquor stores. So keep safe distance. More distance equals more bottles. And so this gentleman says, I need bottles. So maybe I should try standing by that tree, right? So in our country also, we saw a lot of people, social distancing just went out the window the moment that alcohol was being sold. So India reopened alcohol shops at the weekend after shutting them on the 24th of March. In India, one thing that's very notable is that women are generally the ones who spearhead the campaigns for alcohol bans. This, by the way, later on in the interactive session, I am not trying to make a stance saying that I'm pro-ban or pro-non-ban. Okay, this is just stating it as it is. A few states in India have also banned and restricted alcohol sales, including Bihar and a few states in the northeast like Mizoram. Although some women in Bihar say that the 2016 prohibition has helped to curb domestic abuse, others say that such bans push alcohol consumption underground. So as an academic, it is my job, and it is, all of our jobs as researchers, as scholars, to problematize everything. And so even alcohol bans are problematic in the sense that maybe, they push the alcohol consumption underground. And so you have a lot of incidents of people drinking bad, local alcohol and dying. We've had cases like that even in the Northeast, and I'm sure you've had in your local areas as well. And also, the state cannot legally collect taxes from alcohol sales. So it's a very broad, complicated discussion, and if anybody cares to comment during the interactive session, you're most welcome to. But there's a big but. Studies have shown that there is a correlation between substance abuse, including alcohol, and domestic violence. For instance, this is a very good study, very brief, very well presented. I think it's open source, so I think everybody can have a look at it, by Berg et al., which looks at the effects of husbands' alcohol consumption, married women in through 3 low-income areas. This was a very intense. They did an ethnographic study. There was also a quantitative component. They also, as a part of the ethnographic study, interviewed a lot of married women, and they did find that there was some sort of correlation between statistical relationship between alcohol abuse and domestic abuse. So that's something that we must keep in mind as well during this lockdown. So now the state, again, this comes back to what I was talking, the helplessness that I was talking about in these 2 incidents. Sorry, I'm just going to go back to it. The Delhi government has told the court that once a survivor reaches out, so there was a case moved in the Delhi court by some party saying that, the states should have a very good way of handling domestic violence cases. We need to have a very good mechanism, especially in the situation of a lockdown. But the Delhi government basically told the court that this is what we will do. The telecaller will take the complaint, forward her case to a counsellor, and then, there'll be phone communication. Right? So this was the state's response. And this was criticized by advocates Mithu Jain and her colleagues who were fighting for proper mechanisms to be put in place, saying that what happens after the complaint is registered, So what? If you have somebody as a telecaller getting those calls, something else some action, like I said, affirmative action. So this sort of helplessness, this sort of, I don't know what to do as citizens, is we should not be accepting that from governments. Governments are there for a reason. We elected them to take care of us, even if it is in a pandemic, even if it is in a lockdown. It is their job to look at proper legislation, look at proper policies, and get things into place. So, this is an example. And I think on the 26th of April, the Supreme Court did direct the Delhi government to properly implement the Domestic Violence Act. So these are just some examples of the sort of interactions between state and COVID-19. Now, budgetary allocations for issues related to the safety of women remain underutilized. This is the other thing. While states are throwing their hands up and saying what to do, many of these funds are underutilized. We should know that there was a Nirbhaya fund, which is about 3,400 crore. Okay, but only 63 of the 63%. Allocated, 89% of that allocated fund was not used. How underutilized funds for women's safety and women's issues are? If I asked all of you in the panel, I'm sure everybody would have ideas of how we can ensure safety for everybody. But, it's very disheartening when you see that 89% of the funds allocated are not used. So this is from a Times of India report in December 2019. I don't think much would have changed because of COVID immediately followed 2-3 months later. So no state has used over 50%. Uttarakhand and Mizoram have topped the utilization at 50%, which is interesting, followed by Chhattisgarh and Nagaland 50%. The capital territory of New Delhi has used just 5%. That's very, very dismal. Okay, so how we utilize our funds also very much projects or sort of shows or highlights where our priorities are. And clearly from this, our priorities are not in women's safety thus far. Okay, so this is the other thing. While the focus of the fund, this Nirbhaya fund, has been on initiatives to make public spaces safer for women, Gulati says that the present situation warrants that a large allocation should go towards support of domestic abuse victims. So instead of using it, because right now putting mechanisms in place for safety it's very difficult because people are in lockdown mode. Nobody can go out. Nobody can move around freely. So better to use this to rehabilitate or to help people who are stuck in situations of domestic violence. And also the other thing is that was very disheartening. The government did not really consider the needs of women and girls. And it was in the sense that it was only after a huge public outcry, I think everybody will remember this, that feminine hygiene products were included in the government's list of essential items. Whereas in other countries, they were distributing them for free. Here, people had to say these are essential commodities. And so, this is a commentary on where priorities lie and where focus is. Definitely not presently on the safety of women and children, perhaps. But in a nutshell, we need a change in our mindsets, right? Bhakti Chaudhary, a counselor with Women Power Connect, Pan-India Advocacy on Women's Issues, says that the silence around domestic violence needs to be broken and the subject needs to be mainstreamed. Okay, so in other words, we need to stop stigmatizing domestic violence. We need to stop stigmatizing women's issues. We need to mainstream them. We need to talk about them as a society. We need to talk about them with our children. We need to talk about them with each other freely. Because when you start speaking about things freely, so many changes can take place. As long as we hide them and we stigmatize people who go through these things, it's very difficult. Now, media representations of the domestic violence. Now, this is very interesting. The media often reports the incidents as men becoming more abusive, which is not the truth. It's not that because of COVID-19 suddenly men have become extremely more abusive. No, women are already suffering abuse, but they're being attacked more often by their partners because of the situation that we've spoken about before, right? So that's an important distinction that the media needs to learn to make. Another thing is referring to homicides as coronavirus murders or corona murders or COVID-19 murders or quarantine murders, very unhelpful. And it points to a much bigger problem in the way that society understands domestic violence. We think of domestic violence as being episodic. This incident happened, that incident happened. Whereas actually it's not episodic, it is a pattern that is embedded. It is a habitual behavioral pattern that is embedded into perpetrators. So it is not a certain, it is not episodic, it is not necessarily incident as such, right? So that's very problematic. So when you see corona murders, it seems like corona is the reason that these murders. So it takes away from the seriousness of the issue, in other words. So I asked everybody, I know if you were with me from the beginning of the presentation, I said, please remember the China jokes, husbands and wives getting separated because of quarantine, and we all had a big laugh about it. But behind that joke, right, humor always hides the darkest truths, as they say. Humor always hides the darkest truths. So behind that, you can think about how much of violence might have been involved behind all of our memes about people are getting divorced because of quarantine. I have been seeing so many memes about each other because of being in a lockdown situation. I don't think it's funny at all. In a positive sense, it's a good time for families to kind of find each other again in love, and to grow together in as a family. but in a negative sense, there's a so things are not only negative. I just want to add there's a lot of positivity as well, but my job today is to focus on the negative aspects, so that's what I'm doing. Anyway, sensationalism does not help. Coronavirus murders, right? Like nobody sensationalizes as well as some sections of the Indian media. I think everyone will have a comment to say, so I'll not go much into that. Humor, like I said, divorced couples fighting, these things are not helpful. Right? They're fun for the moment, but if you just let humor be humor and let sensationalism be sensationalism, you'll never have a comprehensive, nuanced understanding of what the situation is really, what is really happening in the situation. And these kind of things construct the narrative that the virus is to blame. That is the worst thing. That these murders don't happen otherwise; they're happening because of the coronavirus. That is a falsity. That is a falsehood, rather. Okay, so that is not true. These murders happen all the time. It's just that coronavirus has made it a little more visible. The reason being, we will get to that. See some of these examples. Britain's first quarantine murders. Husband is charged with killing wife. Quarantine murders, right? Coronavirus murder. Husband strangled wife 44 years to death. Man accused of Britain's first self-isolation murder. It's not enough to say corona murder and quarantine murder. Now there's, self-isolation murder. Really sad cases, but also a little insensitive in the way that these have been presented is what I'm trying to get at. So focusing on any other specific factors like COVID-19 masks oversimplifying domestic violence. And there is a lack of nuanced approach to reporting domestic violence as a form of coercive control embedded in a pattern of behavior. This is what I've been talking about. The problem is that we tend to look at these murders, we tend to look at incidents of domestic violence as episodic, and that's very problematic because I think we need sustained, comprehensive reportage on this, and for that to happen, reporters have to be invested, they have to understand domestic violence, they have to understand the patterns in which it occurs, they have to understand how it occurs instead of just saying this happened. Coronavirus murder. So that is a problem with the media narrative on these violences. So this is what I was talking about just now. Other crimes are decreasing, but not domestic violence, which is making it much more newsworthy these days. And that is why you suddenly feel that there's a spike. But sadly, this creates a media loop in which there is a misreporting. And therefore, you think that, it is because of coronavirus that these things are happening. Otherwise, it doesn't happen. Nobody, apart from people who are here in this webinar, majority of the people will be thinking that so many incidents, okay, because of coronavirus, this is happening. No, even if coronavirus goes away, those incidents will keep happening. The media will just not report, is the point that we are trying to make. So, but in India, of course, lots of print and online media have been reporting, of which I have also been a beneficiary. The Hindu, EPW, I think everybody reads EPW, DNA, News 18, Tribune, Diplomat, Wire, PTI, which is a news agency, Press Trust of India. Then there's Hindustan Times. There's a lot of different sources. I couldn't name all of them, but these are some of the people who have reported. Now, my question to you, I think is my third question to you is, have you seen reports of domestic violence during lockdown on television? Full disclosure, I barely watch broadcast journalism more because I think it's become a little bit circusy. But for those of you who still do watch, maybe you can tell us. I don't think print usually does a lot of really great, good groundwork reports, which sometimes is missing from broadcast journalism. That is my opinion. Yeah, all of you are very welcome to disagree with me. So certain questions that come out, okay, certain questions and certain key things, key points that come out of this. Does an increase in reporting mean that violence against the women has increased, or does it just mean that it has become more visible for eyeballs? Because, like we said, all other crimes have subsided, domestic violence remains the same. The second question that is there is one of meaningful, nuanced reportage. Right? Where you're not just treating something as a sensational murder, rather you are doing a comprehensive long-term reportage on it. Sustained investigation, focus more on thematic rather than episodic. Look, even in my present study, there's another study that I'm doing presently. I'm looking at representation of the Northeast. One of the big problematic issues that I'm facing is that there are some very, very complex inter-ethnic issues which are very simply packaged as communalism, right? Or or xenophobia or something. Whereas these issues are much deeper and much more complex. But when you have a parachute journalist who suddenly arrives on the situation and has to report on an incident where 5 people were killed, it's so much more easier to just say, package it as communalism. So it's extrapolating that same sort of idea. When you talk about domestic violence, you say, okay, coronavirus murder, this happened. Oh, how bad, how horrific, how horrendous. But you're not asking the real question that should be asked there as an investigative journalist. What is, look deeper into patterns of behavior, look deeper into what is domestic violence. Has it happened over a long period of time? But no, we are more interested in the immediate and the spectacle, which is problematic. Some things do happen that are very, incident-based, very episode-based. For instance, right now, if behind me a spaceship landed, none of you would do a thematic analysis of the spaceship landing in my office. You would do an episodic, report of that. But in cases like domestic violence, it would help to have thematic coverage, right? The other thing we have to remember is very challenging to get interviews, detailed stories, especially in India. So let me little bit run to the defense of media. It's very, very difficult for media people, not just media people, academics. I've had colleagues and I've had friends who've tried to extract information on domestic violence from survivors of domestic abuse, and it's very, very difficult because of the stigma that's associated with it. So this is something that we must keep in mind. Another thing is that can we use online resources? So for instance, in the Chinese social media, Weibo, anti-domestic violence hashtag has been running. I don't know how many of you were even aware of this, right? We were so busy over here sitting and laughing, saying that they're getting divorced. Whereas actually in China, this hashtag anti-domestic violence was actually trending. Okay, but I have always had reservations for movements primarily focused only on the online because, questions of divides of different kinds, like the digital divide, come into play here. For instance, the Me Too movement and, how effective was it and who was it effective for? It's more the question. But this is a fourth, I guess, the fourth question I'm throwing to you all. Can we use online resources more? And what are the problems that using online resources more might impose? Now, what countries can do to protect those at risk of domestic violence amid the pandemic? Several countries have already thought of very innovative ways. They've taken very innovative steps. Like new campaigns have used social media to spread awareness of resources available. Again, online means, right? Countries have also shifted to virtual court hearings, which is a great solution instead of shutting down courts. Now, the French government has announced it would put, I'm sure all of you must be aware of it, announced it would put victims of domestic violence in hotel rooms and finance pop-up counseling centers and grocery stores. Spanish government has also initiated a new campaign encouraging women to call a helpline and assist in all services to help victims of domestic abuse. Right? So they've kept their services open in Spain. South African government has gone beyond both of these and has also kept courts open for urgent protection orders, and it has an active texting line through which victims can seek help. Okay, so different countries, it's not that countries are just sitting idle and twiddling their thumbs. They're all trying to do different things, none of which seems to be working 100%, but these are efforts that are being made. In France and Spain, there's a movement that was the pharmacies were being trained to identify people facing abuse through code words asking for mask 19. Right? And in India, we have our own version of that. It was called the Red Dot. So it was an initiative by Women and Entrepreneurs for Transformation, by this group. And they would have, women would paint a small red circle, red dot in their hand and send, show that to somebody or send that through email. But again, we can discuss very much the effectiveness of such measures. But yeah, so we did have something of an initiative there. And Uttar Pradesh, the cops, the police have actually put up an advertisement with the message, "Suppress Corona, not your voice," with a sketch of a woman wearing a mask. That's a very, very commendable initiative, I thought. And so I wanted to add it here in our presentation. So states in different capacities, different arms of the state, different branches of the state, different countries are doing different things as much as they can to help with the situation. Local NGOs can track cases that were known to them. That is one thing that can be done. As India Scouts for Accommodation, providing for abuse victims also can be part of the same efforts. Okay, so this is suggestion. We're coming to the suggestion. The last part where I said we would also go into an interaction. So microfinance institutions, like small microfinance institutions, but particularly those which are like self-help groups, can now serve two purposes. One is complaint points as well as providers of livelihood in these times. So we have a few self-help groups even around here, around the campus. Some of them run kind of cooperative to distribute vegetables. Some of them have small, eateries running, and they do home deliveries. So these are some examples that I have seen, and I think this suggestion could work really well, where you have self-help groups providing both livelihood as well as a place to complain and to talk. And inclusion of focus so our Prime Minister Modi has a very large following on television, and so when he says go and bang your pots and pans at 9 o'clock, people are doing it. So when he says go and light a candle at 10 o'clock, people are doing it. So the idea is that if he were to focus on this, on the issue of domestic harmony or on domestic violence rather, then that might actually influence a lot of people, and we might hopefully see a drop in the domestic violence cases in the country. So in conclusion, this is the very second last slide. I won't keep you all much longer. It's been quite long. In any crisis, women and children are often the most vulnerable. In the COVID-19 crisis too, this has been the case. Lockdown has been disastrous for victims of domestic violence globally and even within the country. Not because we are against lockdown, please understand. All lockdown mechanisms should be set in place to do it well, okay? I just wanted to, sort of add a caveat there. The media can play an important role in mitigating situation. Nuance and sensitive reporting is required. Many measures can be adopted by states and individuals. We can also, keep an eye out, keep an ear out, be available for friends. Just because you have socially distanced yourself physically doesn't mean you have to socially distance yourself in every way. I mean, be there for people, especially those of you who are teachers. You can at least be there for your students. Check up, email, ask them how they are. A lot of things might, take place from that. It's not just the state's responsibility. We all have individual responsibility, and I think that's so important to stress on in terms of domestic violence and in curbing it, in how we raise our children, in how we teach our boys and girls, in how we interact with people, in how we're there for other people, younger people, right? So be the person you needed when you were younger is one of the best advice that I received, and I hold it quite dear till today. And lastly, everybody can play a role in the fight against the shadow pandemic, domestic violence and COVID-19. So I end with that. Thank you, everybody. Stay safe and stay sane. All right. Over to you, Dr. Raj. I'm done.
Yeah. Thank you very much. It was a very good presentation. Really, it was erudite presentation. Well researched. You have done a lot of homework. And I see a lot of appreciation coming in the chat box.
Oh, I've not seen anything in the chat box.
You can see, the chat box, you'll see.
Now
I request the participants to unmute your mic and then ask question. Based on the previous experience, I would like to remind the participants, we have only discussion. We don't have debate. And ask question which is very reflective, which gains knowledge for each one of us. As soon as when we talk about domestic violence, women-related issue, many men jump on the topic and then they corner the presenter. I don't want that to happen. So, ask your genuine, reflective, and research question, which will take us forward.
Good afternoon, Father. This is Oma Gopal from Bangalore.
Yeah, please.
Hi. Your presentation was extremely crisp and very informative. Well, I'll come directly to the point. We have a few matrilineal societies in India, isn't it? Like you are from one, Meghalaya, Kerala, a few communities are matrilineal, and even in Karnataka, we have a few communities that are matrilineal. Do you have data that there is less of domestic violence, whether COVID or not, in such societies, since you've done extensive research on this?
Okay, all right. Okay, so this is okay. So now my specific aim in this was to look at domestic violence during pandemic. There was no data for me to source from in such a short period of time locally. But what I will tell you from experience is that people. You have correctly named our societies like Meghalaya as matrilineal and not matriarchal. Okay, so basically we just trace our lineage from the mother's side. When I say we, I'm not a local here, but generally the Khasis, Garos, and the Jainte tribes trace their lineage from the mother's side. Yeah. But that being said, what I do know from my past experiences with social workers here is that domestic violence is rampant. It is quite rampant, especially in the rural areas, is what I have been told by friends who are in the field. And so this idea, because people who are not from here have this idea that because we are these regions are matrilineal, there are less cases or less incidents of domestic violence, and there's more awareness of sexual and reproductive rights, which in my experience hasn't been the case at all. You only have to go to a village, maybe say 10 kilometers out of Shillong, to see young girls, 16-year-olds, 17-year-olds with 3-4 children. So it's very complicated and it's very different here, because here, this idea of, because they're matrilineal, this idea that the father has to provide is not really there. Okay, so I don't mean to sound
double whammy,
but yeah, so you have this, you have men who have, who father children, in different. So the case here is entirely different, but. To answer your question very briefly, is domestic violence not prevalent here? Absolutely, it is prevalent.
It's a myth.
It's a myth. It's a myth that women's. In fact, I don't know if you've heard of this newspaper called the Shillong Times. The editor is Patricia Mukherjee. She had actually invited me to a panel discussion a few months back with Sanjay Hazarika and a few other stalwarts. I was the little fish there swimming with them, but we talked about this, and there is still a lot of gender disparity. And so, to come straight to your point, it's a myth, as you have rightly said. Thank you so much for your question.
Oh, you're welcome. I won't hog much of your time, but, I think the society as such, patriarchal or non-patriarchal, if it's there in the US and UK, I think there is something which is very wrong. We haven't even discussed female genital mutilation. So many issues are there.
Yeah.
Anyway, it's a topic for another day. Yeah.
Yes,
thank you.
Paucity of time, madam. Paucity of time. Yes.
Yeah.
Any other question?
Hello. Hi.
Karen, you can pin your picture. Those people can see you. Stop sharing, and then.
Am I pinned?
Pin your frame. Yeah. Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, who is speaking? Please introduce yourself. Ask question.
Hello, I'm Ragini from Kerala.
Hi, Ragini.
Hi, ma'am. It was a wonderful session. So, what I would like to ask you is that this marital rapes is a very important or serious issue to be dealt with, right? Because even this empowered women or educated women, whatever it may be, they are reluctant to say it in public. And our media has not given that much importance to that also. If you're married means, this is not considered as something great. So, what is your take on it, ma'am?
Oh my goodness, you have asked such a relevant question, and like the questioner just before you, if I had a series, if I could do like 7 webinars with all of you, we would talk about all these things, but you have to understand I had very little time. Absolutely, I think marital rape is problematic, and it's very, very, it's one of those types of domestic violence issues that, number one, women don't like to talk about it because there's a certain shame and stigma. And also, there are lots of people, you'll not believe it, who do not consider it rape because they think that, we have, once you're married, that means that you consent to sexual relations at any time, all the time, which is actually also a myth. And so you have brought up my presentation did not bring it out, but as you have asked me, what is my feeling on it? Absolutely, marital rape exists, and I think Meena Kundasamy had written something on marital rape. She'd written this wonderful book. The title escapes me presently, but it is something that I think especially Indian women need to really, really talk about and destigmatize and bring into the mainstream. I agree with you. Thank you so much for pointing that out and for your query.
Thank you.
Yeah, any other question? Yeah. Please unmute your mic and then ask.
Yes, hello. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Who is
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
who is speaking?
Yeah, this is Pompey. Can you hear me?
Thank you, Dharani. Yes, when I hit you, Meena Kundasamy. Thank you so much. Yes, I can hear you. Yeah, sorry, I was responding to a text.
Yeah, so ma'am, I'm your ex-student from St. Anthony's College. I'm presently pursuing my... Yes.
Hi. How are you?
Long time. Yeah, I'm good, ma'am. Excellent presentation. They're very helpful. I really wanted to ask you about what about psychological violence? Like, a lot of women do not really, especially women who are educated and they are working. So the men in the house do not really, go and beat them maybe. But what about psychological violence, like yelling at them or gaslighting? Those are also abusive in nature and, damaging. So, do you have any data on it, or how much of it is actually harmful, or anything on that, ma'am? Thank you.
Okay, so good to hear from you, Pompey, after a long time. Okay, so psychological violence, I have actually addressed it in the study. It is, in fact, the Indian Act, the Domestic Violence Act 2005, does recognize not just physical abuse, but also verbal abuse, mental abuse, and even economic abuse, financial abuse. So when you talk about mental abuse, it also points at psychological abuse. So this is also a very, very relevant. And like I said, the NCW National Commission for Women actually recorded a great spike in the number of domestic abuse cases. Physical violence. Second to that was on the right to live clause. Right? So right to live clause actually addresses what you just asked me, Pompey, regarding this psychological abuse and emotional abuse and mental abuse. So absolutely it is there. And even in other parts of the country, like when there was an Ebola outbreak or when there was Hurricane Katrina, women were very, very vocal about going through psychological and emotional abuse and mental abuse, and not just physical abuse. So I don't know what you want in terms of data. There's a lot of data out there, and I have presented some data in the presentation itself. But absolutely, psychological abuse is prevalent, and maybe I'll share the slides, the PPT. You can go through some of the data that I've included regarding that. Thank you so much for the question. Anyone else?
Any other question?
Father David, yeah. Hello.
Yeah, please go ahead. This is Father David. Yeah, go ahead.
Karen, I'm Father David. I visited your college in Anthony's. Michael Macri, we're all companions. So good to see you here. Okay.
He was, yes, okay.
You're junior. He was, yeah. My question is, it has been a perennial issue every time. For instance, when we conducted the Women's Day in the college, a group of boys came and asked me, why only for women? Why you don't do for men? Even in this chat, I have seen a couple of times people are also saying, is it only women who are being abused? Is it not men? It only speaks about how the majority, in any instance, the majority still does not understand the problem of minority. For instance, these days, from gospel point of view, St. Paul, we have been reading about St. Paul in the Acts of the Apostles the whole month. He being a Jew, he went and preached for the Gentiles, understood the problem of Gentiles, got their opinion and represented in the council, and he got his way through. My opinion in all this struggle is this: the minority should keep continuing to voice out their opinion, while a lot of awareness has to be given to the majority not in terms of number, it's in terms of power. Unless the majority realizes this difficulty, while the minority keeps continuing to voice out the opinion, I don't think we can bring a balance into this issue. This will be continuing for quite a few a few, I don't know whether centuries or a few years and things like that. So is that a right point of view? I just wanted to get from your...
Okay, so I will tell you that I absolutely agree with you on that particular point. I teach media and gender in the department, and I have never had, trust me, I have been teaching for an odd 8 or 9 years, part-time, full-time, almost 10 years now. In my teaching experience, I have never faced as much resistance to paper as I have to media and gender. And generally, it's not just the boys, it's also the girls who feel that, why is this so? So I do try to bring about parity. I do try to include. I think that any sort of gender conversation that leaves out one half of the genders is sorry, even to say that is incorrect. But basically, when you leave out such a large segment of the population, is incorrect. So I always try to incorporate men and the boys into this talk, because it's not just you can't clap with just one hand. And so I agree with you entirely. But this process of sensitization that you're talking about, I feel that academia now, media and gender courses are also still very I don't think every mass communication department offers it yet. It is still an emergent kind of epistemology that is suited to our country that we are coming up with now. I think the conversation has started now. The internet has catapulted people, has given people a voice. 2000s onwards, we had the Me Too movement, we had lots of people conversing. But at the end of the day, I ended the presentation on individual responsibility, and I believe in that so much. So when you have a chance, if you are an educator, father, like I believe you are, possibly, engage in those questions with your students, and this doesn't have to be only in a media and gender class. It should be a part of every conversation that we have, because like you said, as long as one segment of the population feels that they are being vilified, we will not get anywhere in our fight for parity. The second thing I want to talk about is this idea that, don't men get abused too? Because absolutely, I know of incidents personally where men have been abused by other men, and also even by women. We've had some, very high-profile cases, even in Hollywood and all of that. I will not go into that. But the thing is that the reason why we take it up more as a women's issue or more as a children's issue is because I would say roughly, I think the data was about 97 or 98% of all these cases do pertain to women and children. When we do that, we are not excluding the men that were being abused. They are also included. It's just that we are addressing the majority section that has suffered this sort of abuse. So please, to all the men in the group who are still here, those who haven't left and are listening to this, I just want to say that absolutely this conversation does not exclude men, and it absolutely does not vilify, a particular gender. That is not the point at all. The point is to look at the data, and what the data tells us is that an overwhelming majority of domestic violence cases takes place with women and children, and therefore that is where our focus is. But that doesn't mean that the other half as my.
No, Karen, just one second about this. It's not about excluding one section of it, but I am of the very strong feeling that if you are part of the majority in whatever sense, in terms of power, better not to be thinking about our own selves at that point of time. When another group, which is minority, struggling for issues, you don't talk about your problems at that point of time because it is insignificant at that point of time when we are actually fighting for a noble cause. So that is where I was even supporting this voice. You don't talk.
Absolutely. I agree with you.
Having a men's day when you are ruling the whole thing, and finally you want to have a men's day. So this is a very bad way of understanding the concept itself. So I'm not asking about including it. I'm only trying to say the majority should not be worried about small little issues that happens, forgetting the real issue that is out there when the minority is suffering. That's what.
Okay, thank you, David.
Okay, thank you so much, Father David. I got your point. Thank you so much. Yes, I understand.
Yeah. Is there any other question?
Good evening, Father. Can I?
Yeah. Who is this?
Hello, ma'am. Hello, ma'am. You're so sweet, and we had very wonderful session.
Thank you so much.
Are you hear me, ma'am?
I can hear you. Yes.
Yeah. Ma'am, I need to ask one question. This is my opinion also.
Sure.
In 1998, I was a PRO for Raj TV. We launched English News. I arranged that program, and Clement and Mr. Rajiv Nambiar and myself and one more, Malika, she also coordinate with us. But now in that list, my name and Malika name is not there. Clement and Rajiv Nambiar names is there. This is what I know from the Raj TV organization. So why it is happening, ma'am? There is some gender injustice. Is there no, ma'am? Somebody's what they are thinking for ladies, teacher job only applicable for them. This is common thinking. Why, ma'am? What about your opinion, ma'am? Please.
Look, my opinion is that these are mindsets that have to be changed. I don't want to spend too much time on this question because I think it's quite clear. We do have to change how we view, women and how we view their capacities and their potentialities. And I do think that it's important to, change our mindset. But like I said, the conversation just before this question with Father David, we were talking about how majority, not just majority, I think even all of us have to change our mindsets regarding certain things, regarding the sharing of power and regarding how we perceive men and women and the kind of jobs that men can do, women can do. We need a shift, a sort of revolutionary kind of change in how we think. And until that comes, none of this changes. So I would start with a very simple suggestion. It always boils down to the simple basics of trying to change mindsets. Maybe start with yourself and then go on to, whoever else. So that would be my very simple response. We do need a change in mindset.
Dr. Anbarasan is online. Anbarasan, please unmute, ask question. You have posted one question. Sir?
Father, may I ask a question?
Who is speaking?
My name is Ramalakshmi. I'm from Vailtech University.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Thank you, Father. Good evening, ma'am. Thank you for an awesome presentation. My question again is about media representation. In this presentation, you've shared some interesting statistics and information, and also about media representation in terms of reporting. I would like to have your opinion on how can films be instrumental in creating awareness, because that's a basic aspect missing in our society. Creating awareness about domestic violence, one, and second, about discussing domestic violence in mainstream cinema, if films have ever sought that resort.
Have they ever done that? Yeah, if you're looking at, when you speak about films, it is such a broad landscape, right? You have Hollywood, you have Bollywood, you have Hindi cinema, you have your cinema that's happening in Kerala in the South. We have our own fledgling cinema going on here. It is a very powerful medium, and I absolutely do think that it would have a very tangible impact, because something, there are people who celebrate our superstars. I mean, okay, one of the things, let me be very honest, one of the things that fascinates me about the South is the relationship that the southern states have with their film stars. So for instance, the fanfare or the idol worshipping that happens with Rajnikant, the kind of power that these superstars yield, I do think, agree with you to a certain extent that it could, change. I think, and there are some examples coming here and there. Films like Chapak have tried to talk about acid attacks, right? And if you don't think about films as only, if you think of cinema as not just fiction, but also non-fiction, then you do have documentaries like India's Daughter. That was a very good commentary on, the Indian mentality about women and gender violence and rape and things like that. And you also have even documentaries like Kakkus, which I watched, which also looked at, it looks at these scavengers, but also looks at the gender angle. So, but, for films, the problem with films, and I'll be very direct with you, is that they have an economic angle. And so if a film is not going to sell, the filmmakers are not going to make it. So and the thing with film is, I have argued with people about this. I do think that it is a very exclusive medium. Please understand, when I say exclusive medium, I don't mean in terms of watching it, but in terms of who gets to make a film. So we had like 200 odd people today. How many of them have made a film would be very less. I have made some student films and some, amateur films. But apart from that, how many of us have made films? Very few. So I don't put so much of hope on cinema to talk about, domestic violence on a broad scale. Maybe independent films will do it. But do I think that, today, tomorrow, maybe Amitabh Bachchan and Abhishek Bachchan and all the Khans will get together and start making films on domestic violence? They will not do it unless an excellent script comes their way, because at the end of the day, it is about economics, which brings me to that we need to broaden the platform of media discussion beyond, our traditional media, and maybe think about in terms of, I would suggest back to you, I know that was a suggestion and a question also in terms of film, but my suggestion would be, can we broaden, our minds, our horizons a little bit to think about maybe online platforms as a good and very, widespread way, very easy in terms of everybody has the access to put up a WhatsApp status. That's also broadcasting. You can put up a Facebook status, that's also broadcasting. And so I feel like there is much more potential and power there. While alternative media will never really replace mainstream media, quote unquote, I do think that, we need to start looking at alternatives to punctuate the mainstream. So in a nutshell, films could, but will they is the question that I would ask.
Okay.
I hope that answers.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Anbarasan sir, are you in the discussion?
Thank you, and okay.
Yeah, he has asked one question. I will read out, Karen.
Yes, please.
It seems violence and abuse is sort of universal across cultures. Is violence all the time one way or they are mutual? Is there some data on reverse abuse?
Okay, so I will be full disclosure. Thank you for the question, Dr. Ambarasan. I full disclosure, there will be data on reverse abuse. I did not look them up for this particular presentation, but I do know, not data, but I do know of incidents we're talking about. And violence is never really only one way. So it is more complex and nuanced. But like I've said before, the reason why we do focus on this angle of violence or this gender-based violence or in this particular line of thinking is because it is the most prevalent and the most widespread. In terms of data to say that to you right now, presently, I don't have it, but I do know that there is. And I also don't think that things like violence, things like power, right? These don't happen in vacuum, and they are definitely not unilateral. These are all things that operate in multilateral ways at multiple nodes in multiple trails. I believe that is the case. But do I have data to share with you presently regarding reverse violence or what you called it? I don't have that presently, but I know that there is. So sorry, I can't provide you with data.
Is there anyone to ask question now? There are so many men and women are in the discussion. Please raise your question or any informative idea you can also share with us on this topic.
Please, you don't have to ask me questions. A lot of your colleagues and friends. You can actually give.
Can add information.
Yeah, you can add information. I am from a media background. If anybody is from pure gender background and some statistics that I don't, please feel free to share. This is not one way, like Professor has said. It's bilateral or multilateral. Actually, so many people.
Karen, I have a question to you.
Yes, sir.
When we talk about domestic violence, what about on a day-to-day basis? People at the lower stratum of the society, like Dalits, Adivasis, children, or the prostitutes, they face a lot of violence on a day-to-day basis. They're all reported in the mainstream media. What happens to them? Even during the lockdown period, they are the worst sufferers. How do you account for it? Yeah.
It's very sad that with the lowest rung of people, and I started my presentation by saying that the worst sufferers are, like you said, Dalits, like the Adivasis, people from the lowest economic strata. They're the ones who suffer the most. Their stories are the most silenced. Now, even I was looking at another presentation, and I was looking at a lot of news reports, and a lot of these news reports have actually, even on just the migration during the migrants' problems, migrants' discourse, you will see that you don't see so many stories focused on women. Or just if you look at the images also, it's mainly on the men. And I'm sure that there's a lot of things happening there, but our media can be very, very selective. And that is the problem. That is why I always talk about symbolic annihilation, because the stories of Dalit women, the stories of Adivasi women, women of poorer strata of society, when they do usually their stories are not told. So I think you will agree with me. If you were to randomly flick through a television broadcast, television journalism, any TV news channel, you will not see these women. You will not even see the men. The second thing is, so they are omitted. And even if you do see them, it's trivialized. You have so many, they bombard you with so many of these things that, we have, whether we like it or not, we have taken it for granted that this is how it must be, that these poor people, that the lower castes, the people in the lower economic strata must suffer. And we somehow, as a society, forget about the media, as a society, as a whole, we have accepted that this is acceptable. How that happened is a very long discourse, but we have accepted that has happened, and the media is only a reflection of us at the end of the day. And so these people are omitted, they're trivialized, and even if they're not omitted or trivialized, they're condemned. That is why I brought up the question of why is it that always when we talk about domestic violence, in the context of poorer sections of society, yes, it happens there more. Yes, it needs to be addressed. But there is a condemnation there, Dr. Raj.
Yeah.
Please understand the condemnation there, because they are saying that it is these poorer men, it is these migrant men, it is these men, it is these Adivasi men, lower class men, tribal men who are committing these atrocities. And when you create a narrative like that, the other half of the domestic violence that is going on, the media is silent about.
Yeah.
And so I think we have to be very clever in terms of, all publicity is not good publicity. How you show certain things.
Yeah.
Do you agree, sir?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah. This, you started, what you call it, you wrongly switched the turn off the captions. In a computer, you turned on the captions.
Yeah.
There will be a CC in the main.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, is it okay now? I've turned off.
Yeah. Okay.
Still.
Yeah, whatever you speak, it will get translated.
Okay. Oh, all right.
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Okay. Yeah. Any other question from the participants? Still, there are 150 people are in the discussion. Please unmute your mic and then ask question. Also, yeah.
If no one has any question, I have a suggestion maybe.
Yeah, it's Uma Gopal.
This is Uma Gopal.
Yeah.
Uma Gopal. Do you think, giving reservation to women 33% at least, we are not saying that we are beggars, in the parliament can actually bring about a huge change, because in grassroots level, where we see in panchayat area, Gram Panchayat, a few states are even mulling, like in Orissa, they are mulling over 50% reservation. And some few South Indian states have really done well, where grassroots, Gram Panchayat women have been given a little more priority. Do you think that could be a solution? I don't know. It starts from home, but legislation also is very important.
Absolutely, yeah.
What do you say?
I since you said it was a suggestion and you framed it that way, I'm just going to agree with you wholeheartedly and say, yeah, I absolutely agree. I've had a lot of conversations about reservations. You will understandably, there's a section that is very irked by the very mention of the word reservation in our society. But like Father David previously said that when you have this sort of majoritarian, minoritarian sort of polarity, and this polarity is not just in terms of numbers, but in terms of opportunities and in terms of, franchises of avenues available, then I do believe that, reservations would be an awesome way to go ahead. Let me say this, my mother belongs to the state of Mizoram. My father, by the way, happens to be from Mangalore, Coimbatore. He's actually a Coimbatore boy. Mangalore, he grew up those places. But where my mom comes from, Mizoram is a state that, although we have very good statistics in terms of women's participation in the economic strata. So we have, I think, the highest per capita number of women in the urban areas. So that in certain ways it's really good, but if you look at it the other way, we don't even have one female representative. We don't have even one female representative in the assembly, which is disappointing, to say the least, in 2020. For a state that was progressive, for a state that talks about being progressive and safe for women, there's just no space. And so I feel that reservations are not, it's not about begging, or it's not about, giving somebody that is not their due. Reservation is about giving somebody or helping somebody to get sort of near where their due should be. I don't know if that makes sense. But so, for instance,
because we have parliamentarians.
Yeah.
We have parliamentarians who say, "Ghar mein jao roti banao. Why are you coming to the parliament?" Or "Bal kati mahilaye." These are the kind of slurs that are mentioned in the parliament. So forget about the common man, what they have to undergo.
Okay.
Absolutely. So I agree with you.
Yeah, legislation is also very important. Yeah, we must move towards that.
Thank you.
Yeah. Alex Parimalam, you want to ask a question?
I want to add a point to the discussion. I think both of them have been correct. In the panchayat, at least in India, in village panchayats, there is a good number of representation of women. But unfortunately, they are namkevas. Their husbands are, in fact, they are the panchayat leaders. So it's not the number that matters. Yes, the good number of women have to be there in the parliament, in the assembly. However, what type of women or what class of women, what the representation of which society they are representing, that is very, very important. Otherwise, they will only replace the male mentality there, just abiding by the rules and regulations given by the male chauvinistic members of the parliament and assembly. So it matters which type of representation, which type of community they are representing. So this is what I feel, basically.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's true. See, Uma Gopal, I should probably call her ma'am, Mrs. has also just mentioned it. You're absolutely correct. Because just saying representation, look, there's a difference between representation and meaningful representation. That is what I always say. Somebody said to me once, because I study representations of the Northeast, and somebody said, once Northeast starts making money, you'll be represented more. It's not that simple. I always tell my students, I always talk about the difference between just quantitative representation and, a very meaningful representation. So that's the point that you brought up. There's no point in just giving people reservations or, that sort of this much of representation will be given to you if it is not going to be meaningful. So those are, yes, absolutely, those are challenges that are there. So thank you so much for pointing that out and bringing, adding that to the conversation. Yes.
He's one of my colleagues, ma'am. Alex Parimalam, in the department. Yeah, any other question? Alex Parimalam, do you want to continue, ask any question?
No,
I agree with that point. Yes, that's very good.
Continuation of the point, even in cinema also, people say that if the women in huge number, if they become the directors and if they become the producers, lot of changes will happen. Unless the ideology, unless the thinking pattern of that particular woman changes, he will also look at the woman as a commercial product. She will also look at the woman as a domesticated person. So that's where it is. Unless ideologically the women is at its fight, and then at certain level that representation is at its represented. Otherwise, mere Hindi will say that Namtevar just for name sake if somebody is promoted, he is a replacement male director, male producer. In media also, the context is also applicable in media also.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. So I lost half of the other half of what you said because the line wasn't clear. But
Yeah.
Could you hear Dr. Raj?
Alex Parimala, your voice was not fully heard.
I was just saying it's also applicable in the media line also. People think that if a woman director comes, or if a woman becomes a producer, there will be a total change of representation of women, the way the woman is being represented as women. It's not true. If woman producer or if the woman director also sees a woman from point of view, she will see that woman as a commercial product. That's what I just made.
Yeah, I agree with you. But to the extent that I will say this, Siddharth Varadarajan has written about minorities. Representation of minorities, especially in newsrooms and diversity in newsrooms and all of that. One of the points, not just he, another Robin Jeffrey talks about the Unyal Cooper survey, which was done in 2000, where they actually, there was a survey done, where actually the survey found that among the top 300 representatives of media people, just to answer your point and maybe not counter it, but broaden it a little bit. So what the survey found is that, of the top 300 people at that time in top media positions, not one of them was from the SB or ST community, right? From the scheduled caste, from the scheduled tribe communities. Very, very few were women. And so these things, whether we see, yes, at an individual level, Sir Alex, I agree with you, at an individual level, if you have a person, even if the woman is a director, even if the director is a woman, if that woman has backward sort of regressive ideologies, there's no point. Correct. But when you look at this from a systemic perspective, from a broader perspective, a perspective of changing the system or, subverting, sorry, I had to use that word, but maybe subverting the system, then you have to understand that having women in positions as director, maybe all of them will not have progressive ideas, but maybe some of them would have progressive ideas. So when you have more diversity, even in media houses, in your film houses, in the top positions, in government positions, in Gram Panchayat, right? Even though the representation may not be immediately meaningful, I think as time goes by, some progress will be made. But I do believe that is a good place to start making progress from. So I agree with you that representation is not meaningful representation necessarily, absolutely. But I also still do say that more diversity in representation will give us a better chance at better representation.
Deepa, you want to ask a question?
No one is asking the question. Absolutely can. Our own experience in the department of...
Can you hear me?
Loyola College. Hello.
One second, wait. Yeah.
Hello.
Alex,
hello.
go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I agree with you, Karen. I just want to add, in the Department of Visual Communication, Loyola College, we have 10 students out of 50 students. 10 students are girls and 40 students are the boys. It makes a lot of difference. It makes a lot of difference that when we have the complementarity aspect is coming in, and the sensitivity towards the women issue is they bring in a lot of issues. And even outside the class also, they share quite a lot about their difficulties. In that way, as media person, we are preparing the future media persons. We are sensitizing the men also. That is also required. Like the younger generation of the media persons have to be sensitized on how you need to look into the difficulties or issues of the women.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah, Deepa. Deepa, you can ask question.
Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Yes. Please just call me Karen.
Ma'am, actually,
Okay.
Karen, thanks a lot for such a beautiful presentation. And I was really, it was really fortunate to have such a wonderful presentation because it was really insightful and it's full of facts and you did a thorough research for the whole presentation. Thank you, ma'am, for, devoting your time and effort for this. And my question is, it's actually kind of a reflection because I'm listening to a lot of my colleagues' complaints these days because the lockdown and staying safe at home norms kind of brought a lot of toil and hardship for women, particularly those who have to manage their work from home and their family life, their kids' academics, etc. from home itself. And some even say that those women who can multitask all this stuff can survive. Even when, it's kind of a cliched stereotype. Women must be multitaskers, to perform like this. So don't you think, and we had a Mother's Day in lockdown recently, and a few friends of mine were saying that celebrating a Mother's Day in lockdown, particularly in a situation where these kinds of social distancing and lockdown are causing a lot of toil and hardships on women of the household, it's kind of a glorified slavery. So don't you think this kind of stereotyping is too much, that women have to be multitaskers and women have to be, around all the time, tasking and taking care of the work, household, and their kids' responsibilities simultaneously? Don't you think it's too much?
Yeah, look, as we absolutely, the thing is this, is that I wouldn't call motherhood, I wouldn't go as far as to call it glorified slavery, but I don't dismiss the people who do say it because I am not mother yet, so I don't know exactly everything that it entails. But the point that I'm trying to make is that, the problem with our society is that we are still stuck in essentialism mode. So we basically have a very essentialist view of what women are and what their duties are and what men are and what their duties are, right? So, and even though I come from myself personally, I come from a very progressive, sort of very broad, multicultural family, even though I come from such a, very privileged background, very blessed to have the family that I have, but still even there's lots of, there's certain things to be done in the house that, especially in the lockdown, because, it falls on women to do the housework. I don't know if men share. I'm sure that men are also helping, but majority of the times it's women do have to do the housework, and it's been difficult. So if a colleague of mine says, let's meet tomorrow at 9 a.m. or 10 a.m. or 11 a.m., I have to calculate very quickly in my head, and it happens very automatically now because I now have to get up that much earlier to be able to finish everything in the house so that I can go and do that thing. Right. So, but then that same pressure is not there on men. I don't think saying that women have to multitask is necessarily a bad thing. But the point is that men also should multitask. Men also have to multitask. I think multitasking is a necessity of the modern, of modern lifestyle, more or less. But that we say that multitasking is especially reserved for women is, I think, very unfair. It's beyond a stereotype. It's something more archaic. It's a very parochial sort of thinking. So thanks for your feedback. Yeah.
Saranya, are you in the online? If you unmute your mic, you can ask question. Otherwise, I'll read out. Saranya? Okay, I'll read out the question, Karen.
Yes, sure.
What is your opinion on media reporting on only sensational gender-based violence issues that would inflate their popularity?
Yeah, look,
Sensation,
obviously, sensationalism or what? Censorship?
Sensationalism.
Sensationalism.
Gender-based violence issues. Yeah, media only concentrates only on that.
Yes, I agree. That is why I presented and I wrote about, coronavirus murders and, husband kills wife in fit of rage, that kind of thing. We do that a lot. And it's not just the Indian media, trust me. It's media all over the world, because at the end of the day, sometimes I wonder, do we expect too much from media? Because at the end of the day, a lot of media, a lot of at least commercial media has to make money. So in order to grab eyeballs, they do sensationalize murders. They do sensationalize. For instance, I just want to talk about this is domestic violence, not gender-based violence. But many years ago, there was a Sheena Bora murder case. I don't know if you all remember that. Sheena Bora was, she was accused of murdering her daughter, basically. And these are people who had Peter Mukherjee's ex-wife. The point is that case, for instance, was also so sensationalized. It wasn't just, people, the reports were not just the facts. The reports went into like their lifestyle, the affairs they had. That kind of sensationalism was there. And I find that with any kind of sustained reporting on, gender-based violence, that sensationalism that this person has just asked me, it tends to find its way in it. Because even if we talk about the Jessica Lal murder or the Arushi Talwar murder, I think everyone here who witnessed that entire thing will agree that the way that it was reported and presented in the media was to a certain extent very sensationalized and very, it became like watching a soap opera, which the news should not be a soap opera. So it's a fallacy that the media has. They pander to eyeballs because they have to make money, and then at the end we get the result that we have a very sensationalized, domestic violence reports, which is not good.
Yeah.
So that's what I have to say about that.
Good. Is there any other question? Yeah, it's a long time. Yeah. Who is
hello?
speaking? Yeah.
This is Nomfangimad from Bangalore.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hello?
Yeah,
Can you
go
hear
ahead.
me?
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to have one general question actually.
Sure.
My question is, as you have told, there are so many violence that they didn't hurt across India. I hope it is very necessary their voice to be heard. So how can we help in the unheard voice?
Okay. Yeah, that's relevant. There are things that can be done on a personal level. There are things that can be done at the sort of community level. There are things that can be done at the systemic level. Okay? So I think at the personal level, what you can do is you can be sensitive to women's stories. You can listen to women's experiences. We can, as a man or even as a woman, the first thing that, oh, she's a woman, that's why she's feeling this, that kind of mindset, if we can remove and look at each other as human beings and, not blame everything on, being a moody woman or PMS or whatever. At the individual level, I think if we give the respect that we earn, I think that's more than enough. And if we treat humans as humans, now at the community, at a broader level, community, right? Interrelational level. What we can do is when we know people who are suffering from domestic violence or whose stories are not being told, I encourage people all the time to write, everybody. Today, the millennial generation, of which even I am part, the post-80s generation has one great advantage of being able to sort of broadcast. All of us have broadcast media at our fingertips. So when you have something, you witness something, or it doesn't have to be gender violence. It can be a story of strength. It can be your mom's story, how your mom raised you up, how her mother raised her up. The struggles that your grandmother went through, your mother went through, or even there are men also who are silenced. Maybe you have friends who have incredible stories who will never be heard. You can do so much, right? I encourage, especially young people, always to write. It doesn't matter that you write. The act of writing itself is an act of, of assertion, and that is so important. At the systemic level, I think this is the most challenging one because we need to change mindsets, and we need to change not just mindsets of people who produce things, but most importantly, we need to change the mindsets of those people like us who consume things.
Okay.
What we expect, what we consume. what we spend our money on, what are the sort of things that we would like to consume. So that is the sort of thing that we need to concentrate on. And for that, there is no one solution. Legislation can help, policy can help, right? And also maybe to a certain extent, economic policies or political policies and legislation, reservations, all of that can help. But at the end of the day, we need to change our mindsets. And the best place to change mindsets, I always say, is in two places. One is at home and two in the classrooms. So I always tell my students that revolutions can start in classrooms. Revolutions do start in classrooms. And so to all fellow activists and teachers, maybe we can start there. There's no one simple answer, but I hope I've given you some suggestions that you can look at.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, is there another question?
Okay.
Hello.
Yeah. Who is speaking?
Yeah, this is Pushparaj Fernando from Madurai.
Yeah, please
Hi,
go ahead.
Yeah, I have got a question for Karen. Ma'am,
Yeah.
it's a wonderful session, and I just have a view. As you rightly said, today the cinema is after sensationalism, the news media is after sensationalism, the print media is after sensationalism. In such a scenario, especially at the wake of COVID pandemic, people almost have lost their trust on media. In such a scenario, what would be your piece of advice for the future aspirants of mass media and journalism course?
Mhm.
Firstly, I would say get the training required. One of the biggest problems with our field, I sincerely believe, is that we have too many untrained journalists who go out there and learn things on the way. We need to have some really good schools. Secondly, to future journalists and to future media people, I know this is going to be a very hard pill to swallow, but I would say do not sell your integrity. The bedrock of great journalism, and India has had great print journalism. People, we had awesome, brilliant, and we still have some great print journalism going on. But it's because these people have refused to pander to just market forces only. I mean, there's a balance that must be maintained. We all understand it. But I would say that the moment you compromise with your integrity, the moment you compromise with your character, your journalism is no longer journalism, it just becomes yellow. And so if you don't want to become a yellow journalist or have your material be stained, don't compromise on your integrity. I know this is a very difficult thing to say to anyone, not just journalists, but to anyone in any field. But that is so important, to be true to the story. Your job is not to say that, okay, he said it is raining, she said it is not raining. Your job is to go look out the window, see if it is raining, and report what the weather is. So, don't compromise on your integrity. I mean, don't become like one of the media that is one of these media people who have sold out and who panders to a certain political class or to a certain economic class. Don't do that. There's still some great journalists doing great work. And we have such a rich tradition of journalism. Just read on them, read on their biographies, and read their pieces, see how they reported, and learn. Learn from the past in the present so that you can handle yourself in the future. That would be my advice to future journalists. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Father, do I have time for one more question, if you don't mind?
Yeah, please. If it is relevant to the topic, please go ahead.
Yes, please. Ma'am, we always look to the Western world for the ideals of feminism. But at the wake of COVID-19, if you see the US press conference, be it the US press conference or any other part of the Western world, the discrimination and the violence against women had been almost the same. Maybe the gradation differs from what we see it in the developing countries like this. So the entire ideals of feminist ideals that the Western world that we look up to have shattered. So what do you think is the way forward? Whom are we going to look up to? The education does not seem to have contributed much. So what do you think is the way forward?
Okay, I just want to say one thing, especially in many branches of the social sciences. I will not say all, but in a vast majority of the social sciences, the problem is that we borrow a lot from Western ideology and Western theories, right? So even in mass media, sort of cultivation theory, agenda setting theory, two-step flow theory, all of the models, everything is Western. And that is why it is important today, as educators and as students and as scholars of media, that we, we come out with our own, we have our own, we build our own ontology, we build our own sort of knowledge base, our own, we have our own ways of looking at the world. That is very important. So even feminism, for instance, it has its roots. Okay, I want to be very, feminism, it depends on your definition of feminism. If you talk about the movement of empowering women in general, that predates the Seneca Falls Convention, that predates, bell hooks, that predates the, African American slave women who stood up for their rights. It goes back to Christine de Pizan. In the 12th century, 13th century, we've had people writing, amazing pieces on women's empowerment before the word feminism was even coined. Now, today, the problem is that feminism has become, as a political entity, has become so divisive, and it has created such polarities in society. I'm talking about the Western model of feminism, that it doesn't really apply to us, right? Because in the 70s, when women were talking about reproductive rights, here we were in India in the 70s, where women didn't even have an education, forget about reproductive rights, where women didn't even get 3 square meals a day. That may still be our situation now. If you go to a rural part of the country, you're not going, and you go and try and apply Western feminism there, it will not work. So what I'm trying to say is that you are asking me, where should we look? That may still be our situation now. I'm not saying we shouldn't look to the West. We should learn. They are pioneers in some senses. What good things we can learn from the West, what good things we can learn from the East, we learn from the East, we learn from the West, doesn't matter. Learning is always good. But ultimately, we have to look at ourselves, at our women, at their experiences, to come up with a model of women empowerment that works for us, to come up with a feminism, if you will, that works for us. So that is what I feel. So where do we look? Introspection. I think we need to, as Indian academics, we need to learn to look within and not outside. So that is what I was.
That's so nice of you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Yes,
is there another question? Last question, maybe, because we have to wrap up the discussion. 2 hours, we are gone beyond 2 hours, more than the expected time. Is there another question? Very pertinent question, if you ask. Okay, I think there are no questions or any other feedback. I take this opportunity to thank Karen Donoghue. It's a very, very wonderful session. In the beginning, you started with some basic theories of gender, media and gender. And we started with the COVID-19 background, gender, domestic violence, both in the global level, Indian context, and the various states. We also gave a lot of incidents, case studies, some of the case studies, very, very interesting. And it's very, very pathetic. And also the National Women Commission, they have termed this as a shadow pandemic. This will continue to persist, exist even after this pandemic and the lockdown is over. So as a media person, we must play a very responsible role, even in reporting or bringing out the issue to the mainstream. You have raised many, many questions to reflect as women as well as men also. So when we talk about domestic violence, it is both men and women have to play a role. And also, when we were talking about reporting, you said investigative, nuanced reporting and so on, which I liked. During this pandemic, apart from violence taking place inside the house, government also were not sensitive to the needs of women. That also you pointed out, which was very touching. And also, for all the questions raised, you are very patient in answering. So this discussion will create ripples among the media professionals, young journalists who are going to become writers later. Thank you so much. You have done a lot of homework. You have prepared your PPT. Last week when I contacted you, you said I need some more time to prepare and so on. You have done it well. You can also write a paper on this. So much of points you have. Yeah, I am planning to bring out a small book of all the webinars. I'm completing my 9th webinar today, and I have one more on Saturday. That also I can make announcement for the participants. The role of media in reclaiming the indigenous knowledge on health and medicine during this pandemic. Yeah, because there's so much of knowledge we have about indigenous medical practices and knowledge on health that is not given much importance in the mainstream media, because we are always so much worried about vaccination, allopathy medicine, and so on. How we can boost our immunity through our own natural food, through our own natural medical practices, indigenous, very much to found in our village setup. So that is the next discussion on Saturday. If you want, you can join. I will send the link. I take this opportunity to thank you immensely for this wonderful presentation, wonderful discussion.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, Viscom Department of Loyola College will continue to collaborate with your university, your department. I look forward to more collaboration in the future. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye-bye. Take care.
Yeah,
Stay safe.
yeah. Thank you.